Abdullah ibn Rashid stood on the rim of the Red Desert at sunrise, watching the early light turn the dunes into molten brass. Behind him, the old harbor city of Sirajan murmured awake with the metallic clang of shopkeepers lifting shutters and the distant adhan echoing from the minarets. In front of him, the desert rolled westward for a dozen leagues before it kissed the sea. Most travelers passing through this wind-carved wasteland hurried over the packed caravan road that skirted the shore, but Abdullah's gaze clung to the highest dune, a pale ridge that looked, in the changing light, like the spine of a sleeping giant. That was where he would build the house. He was barely 30, the youngest architect ever licensed by the Guild of Stone and Sky, yet his ambition was older than any monument in Sirajan. While other apprentices memorized load-bearing equations, Abdullah collected folktales, mapping each fable across the topography of his homeland. He believed buildings could tell stories the way pages did, that walls could remember the pulse of a city and keep it safe. Perhaps that conviction sprang from the nights he spent in his mother's library, translating forgotten travelogues by the glow of kerosene lamps. The smell of ink mingled with desert wind in his earliest memories. Together they formed a promise he was determined to keep, to write architecture that would outlive the shifting sands of history. 3 years later, the Gulf Emir announced a competition: design a coastal retreat that would symbolize a new era of commerce between East and West. Economists spoke in numbers Abdullah could barely fathom, but he focused on a single phrase buried in the contract: to be raised upon the dune belt north of the estuary. Most architects balked. The dune belt was notorious for its restlessness. What the wind built at dawn it dismantled by dusk. Foundations cracked there the way thin ice splinters beneath careless feet. But to Abdullah, the impossible sight was a call to prayer disguised as a challenge. His mentors warned him he was courting ruin. Yasmin, the engineer who once shared midnight tea with him beside drafting lamps, met him under the academy's date palms. Islam teaches stewardship, she reminded him, her fingers trembling around a cup of black coffee. Why evoke a verse warning against building on sand only to ignore its lesson? Abdullah pointed toward the skyline, where cranes hovered above half-finished towers of steel. Those verses warn against arrogance, he replied. Humility does not forbid innovation. It requires it. When the judging council announced the finalists, Abdullah's name topped the list. Investors descended like seabirds on a fishing skiff. They praised his daring, but every compliment carried the same unspoken threat. If our money sinks with your foundations, your reputation sinks with it. He accepted the terms, signing with a reed pen that trembled only once, a flicker no one else noticed. The construction yard rose on the dune's spine within weeks. Cargo trucks delivered steel pylons and polymer membranes forged in distant foundries, nanostructured to flex like tendons. Abdullah's design relied on deep anchors drilled through sand until they kissed limestone 15 meters below, paired with floating platforms able to shift without cracking. It was engineering alchemy, a dance between permanence and surrender. On the 5th evening, after the crews had left, Abdullah wandered among the skeletal frames and met Farid al-Khatib, a mason who had retired before Abdullah was born. Farid sat cross-legged in the shadow of a half-erected column, prayer beads sliding through calloused fingers. His beard caught twilight like frost on charcoal. "Peace upon you, son," he said before Abdullah could ask his business on the site. "And upon you peace," Abdullah replied. "Forgive me, the grounds are closed after sunset." "I seek neither trespass nor wage," Farid said. His gaze traveled up the column to the raw sky. "I am only curious which verse you believe will hold this house upright when the wind comes howling." Somehow he had seen the Quranic line embedded in Abdullah's blueprint. "The verse reminds me to be humble," Abdullah answered. "But humility does not forbid innovation." "True," Farid nodded. "Yet humility often speaks through caution. In the story our mothers taught us, the man who built on sand did more than misjudge soil. He misjudged his own heart. He sought praise first and shelter second." The challenge pricked Abdullah's pride. "Does not the Quran also tell us to travel the earth and see how creation begins, so that we may understand?" he countered. "I am obeying that command, testing boundaries to discover new forms of mercy." "Mercy," Farid echoed, rising with deliberate slowness. Dust fell from his kaftan like ash. Then show mercy first to the people who will sleep under this roof. Promise me you will test each beam twice. He pressed a worn leather notebook into Abdullah's hands, a manual of stress measurements annotated in tight, deliberate script. Use it or do not. Either way, remember every calculation describes a soul who will one day trust your math more than his own prayer. That night Abdullah dreamed of the house completed, its curved facade catching starlight like the hull of a celestial ark, until the ocean rose without warning, a black wall that swallowed horizon and foundation alike. He woke to the taste of salt and the sound of Friday prayers drifting from the city. At the masjid he found Fard again, shoulder to shoulder in the line of worshippers. During sujud, Abdullah felt doubts pooling like water around the edges of conviction. When the imam recited, "Is the one who lays his foundation upon piety and Allah's good pleasure better than the one who lays his foundation upon the edge of a crumbling cliff?" The words rang too close, though they came from Surah at-Tawbah rather than Al-Baqarah. The Quran felt alive that morning, weaving different surahs into a single warning. They shared dates and cardamom tea in the courtyard. "You are not the first dreamer who believed he could outwit nature," Fard said, eyes softening. "We have read the verse of light and the verse of the throne. We know God encompasses all engineering. The question is whether we build as servants or rivals." "Then help me," Abdullah pleaded. "Lend me your experience so I can build as a servant." "Old bones and older wisdom are yours," Fard laughed, "if you will carry stones alongside formulas." Construction resumed with new rigor. Fard supervised mortar mixes, insisting on a ratio older than any textbook. Yasmin recalibrated vibration dampers. The crew began to see the project not as a stunt, but as stewardship. They worked through Ramadan nights under lanterns shaped like moons, breaking fast with cool cucumber soup and performing tearaway among the scaffolds. Abdullah quoted hadith about excellence in every action. The workers replied with jokes that soared like sparks into desert darkness. Outside the fence, whispers multiplied. Rival firms predicted failure, investors hedged bets, pundits called it vanity architecture. Each rumor felt like a grain of sand in Abdullah's eye, small but relentless. One July morning, a sirocco rose with extraordinary fury. Wind speed doubled within minutes, whipping silica against the aluminum struts until the air became opaque. Sensors shrieked warnings that anchors were shifting. Abdullah raced along catwalks, shouting orders while grit stung his cheeks raw. On the ground, Farid prayed aloud, reciting, "Allah exchanges nothing but good for those who spend in his cause." It sounded less like liturgy and more like a secret algorithm governing wind and mercy. When the storm subsided at dusk, the skeleton still stood, though several floating panels had warped. Engineers declared repairs feasible. Abdullah collapsed on the sand, lungs burning. Farid crouched beside him. "The dune bows, but does not break when you respect its rhythm," the mason said. That night, between adrenaline surges and exhaustion, Abdullah scribbled 12 pages of revisions, integrating Farid's notes into his master plan. The crescent of the nascent house felt less like a monument and more like prostration itself, a structure performing perpetual sujud against the vastness of the desert. By midsummer the house began to sing. Wind coursed through hidden ducts, producing tones reminiscent of an oud. Passers-by stopped on the coastal highway, entranced. Children pressed their palms to the outer shell and felt vibrations whisper verses translated into resonance. Journalists called it the audible Quran, though Abdullah insisted the sounds were only physics, not revelation. Still, the effect was undeniable. Devotion layered inside engineering, echo meeting echo. Yet beyond the applause, in the unlit hallway of his mind, the old verse still pulsed, building upon sand, destined to collapse. He had deferred the verdict, not escaped it. The desert, like the day of judgment, always waited, patient and impartial. Wind became a constant companion after the Sirocco's trial, threading itself through every calculation, every prayer, every unfinished corridor of the rising house. Abdullah ordered the acoustic engineers to leave narrow, unseen apertures in the outer skin so that each breeze would tune the structure differently, like a carry shifting makams while reciting Quran. The idea pleased him, architecture that could improvise praise. But he also knew it served a practical purpose. Controlled airflow would reduce uplift, coaxing the dune to cradle rather than fight the foundation. Weeks slipped forward. The construction site developed its own liturgy, dawn adhan washing over empty scaffolds, the metallic percussion of hammers at sunrise, afternoon silence when heat shimmered above every tool, sunset stretching cool lavender shadows across steel. And the night shift's slow-burn murmur beneath floodlights pale as moons. Abdullah walked these cycles like circuits around the Kaaba, drawing arcs of intention through every corridor. He slept rarely, dreaming wide awake of load paths and soil shear values. Yet even in that half-sleep he felt watched, not by critics or investors, but by verses memorized in childhood, now lingering between the studs like guardian angels scrutinizing his sincerity. One afternoon, a convoy of black SUVs arrived, kicking dust over the supply road. Out stepped Minister Saeed Al-Murad, envoy of the Emir and reputed kingmaker in the National Council. His delegation toured the premises in immaculate linen, clips on their ID badges glinting. Saeed's expression stayed smooth as polished basalt until they reached the wind organ, a vaulted gallery where polished copper reeds funneled desert gusts into a low, mournful chord. There, he closed his eyes. When they reopened, moisture rimmed the lashes. My father recited Surah Ar-Rahman to me each night, he murmured, voice almost lost to the lingering drone. Hearing these tones is like stepping back into that room. He placed a palm on a still bare plasterboard. How do you engineer nostalgia? Abdullah hesitated. We don't, he said. We invite the wind to remember for us. Saeed smiled, but the slight tilt of his head suggested caution. Remember, too, that nostalgia is fickle. If the house fails, people will recall sandstorms, not lullabies. He left a gold-embossed business card on a crate of ceramic tiles and departed without a backward glance. On it, beneath his title, he had handwritten one ayah, and whatever good you put forward for yourselves, you will find it with Allah. It is better and greater in reward. That night, Abdullah gathered Yasmin and Farid in the makeshift prayer tent perched on the dune's lee side. Desert chill seeped up through the canvas floor, but Farid's eyes burned with a forge-bright conviction. We're past stress tests, the mason said. We need soul tests. Bring the first residents early. Let the house feel human fear and hope before we seal the cladding. Yasmin frowned at the breach of protocol, but Abdullah nodded. Buildings, like people, stiffen dangerously when first confronted by reality. Better they should flex while remedies were still within reach. So they invited the orphans of Dar al-Amal, a coastal shelter slated for demolition, to spend a week inside the unfinished house. 27 boys and girls arrived with threadbare suitcases and a cautious hush usually reserved for hospital corridors. The workers paused to clear debris, fashioning temporary dormitories with viewports angled toward the sea. At dusk the children discovered the wind organ and began chasing echoes along its ribs, their laughter bouncing against copper. Yasmin wept openly. Farid recorded measurements, noting how human footfalls altered the resonance. Midweek, a barometric trough deepened offshore, steering humid air toward the desert. Abdullah's instruments warned of a hybrid storm, less violent than the Sirocco but heavier, carrying rain pregnant with Saharan dust. He stood on the rooftop terrace, palms upturned as the first drops fell. Muddy rivulets streaked the raw concrete. The children squealed, sliding across slick floors, their sandals flinging arcs of watery sand. Instead of shooing them to safety, Abdullah watched patterns form beneath their heels. Each swirl of mud revealed how water pooled, where runoff gathered. He marked those points for drainage revisions. The house, it seemed, was teaching him through play. After rainfall, a strange stillness settled. The dune, saturated, sagged in places like dough under excess yeast. Sensors showed subsidence of 3 millimeters, within tolerance but a sharp reminder of impermanence. Farid knelt to press his cheek to the damp grit. The sand is negotiating, he whispered. Offer it trust, and it will hold, so long as it believes you'll never bind it in chains. Trust translated into engineering the next morning when Yasmin proposed variable footing sleeves, telescoping collars around the deep anchors, able to loosen or tighten pressure in response to micro-shifts. It meant remachining half the substructure, a delay investors would loathe. Abdullah approved without hesitation. Better a late house that stands, he said, than a punctual tombstone. He sent Minister Saeed a detailed brief, bracing for backlash. Instead, Saeed replied with a single line. If you abandon greed, you inherit patience. Proceed. Attached was a reaffirmation of funding. News of the orphan residency reached social media through a volunteer's blog post titled "A Desert Ship for Children Drifting Toward Hope." Within hours, international reporters camped at the site gates. Drones buzzed overhead like mechanized hornets. Initial headlines praised human-centric design. By next day, contrarian columns accused Abdullah of exploiting vulnerable minors as test subjects. Safety regulators demanded inspections. Yasmin handled bureaucrats. Farid calmed workers. Abdullah retreated to calculations, burying anxiety beneath integrals. Yet each night he walked the dormitory hallway barefoot, reciting Ayat al-Kursi over sleeping children, begging protection not just against collapse but against cynicism. On the sixth night, a faint tremor rippled through the dune. No meteorological trigger, merely the earth settling after rainfall. The house responded like a living being. Anchors sighed. Tension cables relaxed. Acoustic ducts shifted pitch, producing a chord so low it thrummed in bone marrow. Abdullah jerked awake. Monitors showed no structural failure, yet the sound unsettled him, recalling that Quranic scene when Earth itself will speak on Judgment Day, listing every secret deed. Hastening downstairs, he found Farid already in the wind organ, hand pressed to a copper reed. "She's praying," the old mason said, listening to her own heart. He guided Abdullah's palm to the metal. The vibration felt like a pulse, steady, resolute. "A house built on sand can still stand," Farid added, "if its humility outmatches its height." By dawn, inspectors arrived, summoned by viral headlines. They carried laser scanners, thermal cameras, a skeptic's scowl. While they probed welds and core samples, the orphans gathered on the terrace to perform a small play they'd written, The Sand and the Stone, retelling the Quranic parable in puppetry fashioned from scrapwood and leftover wire. In their version, the sand was lonely until the stone promised partnership. Together they discovered that only balance kept them whole. The inspectors paused to watch, perhaps ashamed of their cynicism in the face of such earnest art. One muttered, "This place might actually work." After passing compliance checks, the house advanced toward completion. Cladding panels, composite shells glazed with silica harvested from local dunes, sealed outer walls. Under sun they glimmered tawny gold, under moonlight, silver blue, mimicking tidal rhythms. Interior courtyards bloomed with salt-tolerant succulents arranged in spiral patterns echoing Quranic geometry. Recycled gray water fed them through capillary channels, demonstrating environmental wudu. Yet even as surfaces hardened, her questions stayed fluid. Was Abdullah building a sanctuary or a spectacle? Investors rebranded the project the Beacon of Reconciliation, scheduling international summits months before ribbon-cutting. Marketing teams proposed holographic tours, merchandised prayer rugs with the house's silhouette. Abdullah felt ownership slipping like dry sand through fingers. He sought counsel from Sheikh Adil, a scholar who taught tafsir in a seaside madrasa. They sat under an olive tree overlooking tidal flats, sunlight flashing off distant cranes. Abdullah recounted every triumph and doubt. The sheikh listened, eyelids half-closed, then quoted a hadith, "Allah is beautiful and loves beauty." He tapped his cane on the ground. But beauty pursued for applause withers. Make your niyya as firm as bedrock, and no storm will uproot you. For how long must intention be renewed? Abdullah asked. Every heartbeat, the sheikh replied, for sand shifts beneath every step. That is why we return to prayer 5 times a day, the architecture of humility. Abdullah laughed softly, realizing the sheikh had echoed the structural design, variable footings adjusting moment by moment. He returned to the site with lightness in his stride. That evening he convened the crew and recited the ayah that had birthed the project. The parable of those who spend their wealth seeking Allah's pleasure is that of a garden on a fertile hill. He explained that wealth included not just capital but craft, sweat, patience. We are gardeners, he told them, tending a hill of sand until it bears shelter instead of figs. The final test arrived unheralded. At 3:07 in the morning, a magnitude 6.2 quake shuddered beneath the seafloor. Sirajan's harbor walls cracked, ancient domes rattled, glass shattered in downtown offices. At the dune, seismic waves met layers of wet and dry sand, amplifying motion like a sloshed bowl of water. Alarms howled, anchors flexed to design limits, floating slabs skated centimeters. Abdullah sprinted across trembling catwalks, recalling Farid's demand. Test every beam twice. They had tested thrice, but never against this. When shaking ceased after 59 eternal seconds, silence pressed thicker than the night. Abdullah's headlamp cut through dust to reveal columns still upright. Struts bore stress marks with intolerance. Only one casualty appeared, a gilded inscription panel bearing the basmala had fallen and cracked. Abdullah lifted it, lips tasting grit. Yasmin joined him, voice trembling. The house lives. But at what cost? He wondered aloud. She pointed toward the dormitory. The orphans, staying one extra week while new lodging was prepared, emerged in pajamas, unhurt. They gathered fragments of the broken panel, arranging them on a mat like puzzle pieces until the calligraphy read whole again, the cracks forming new veins of light under lantern beams. Farid watched, tears soaking his beard. "Every scar is a signature of survival," he whispered. "Let the world see them." News crews arrived with dawn, expecting ruin and finding resilience. Headlines reversed their tone. Desert miracle. Sand house withstands earthquake that rattled coast. Donations poured into Dar al-Amal. Rival firms requested joint research on adaptive foundations. Investors who had predicted disaster now claimed foresight. Abdullah ignored both praise and blame, walking the perimeter alone until Adhan al-Maghrib painted the sky vermilion. He prostrated on the cooling sand, feeling the ground breathe beneath his forehead, and offered the only words that felt honest. "Rabbi Zidni Ilma, O my Lord, increase me in knowledge." When he rose, he saw that the horizon had blurred, the wind beginning its nightly rehearsal. But tonight its pitch carried a new timbre, gratitude folded into granules, as though the dune itself were whispering Amin. The days that followed the quake unfolded like verses in a surah of patience, each line revealing both peril and promise. Sirajan's old harbor mended its cracked seawall, stone by weary stone, but the house scarcely needed repairs. It only required listening. Abdullah convened daily gatherings where workers, engineers, and even the orphans spoke of what they felt during the tremor. Some recalled a deep bass hum, others a lullaby of shifting dunes. Yasmin charted their testimonies on a massive floor-to-ceiling graph, layering human sensation over seismic data until emotion and mathematics overlapped in luminous bands. Farid called the map a khutbah of resilience, proof that faith and physics could share one pulpit. Yet outside the dune's protective curve, skepticism regrouped. A consortium of rival architects filed an injunction, arguing that the house's adaptive footings violated building codes drafted for static structures. Abdullah traveled to the capital to defend his approach before the National Council of Safety. The hearing room felt like a desert night trapped in marble, chill shadows, harsh lights, and an audience of faceless statues. Minister Saeed sat among the panelists but offered no outward sign of allegiance. When Abdullah submitted his technical diagrams, the lead auditor, a man with silver spectacles and no visible eyebrows, queried every deviation from conventional design. His voice held no malice, only the sterile certainty of a ledger that recognized neither storm nor prayer. "You assume," he said, tapping a stylus against Article 23, "that sand can be persuaded to behave like bedrock. Codes exist to discourage persuasion." Abdullah inhaled, feeling the courtroom's acoustics tug at his words. "With respect, the Quran tells us that Allah created the heavens and earth in truth, and that within creation are signs for those who reflect. Sand is one such sign. Its movement warns, adapts, teaches. Our design doesn't coerce the dune, it listens to it. The code must evolve as much as the terrain." Some panelists frowned at theological references. Others leaned forward, intrigued. Saeed finally spoke. "The Council's mandate is public safety. Demonstrate that adaptive foundations are safer than static ones under the conditions we witnessed last week, and Article 23 will adapt accordingly." Abdullah spent 2 sleepless nights compiling proof. Comparative stress graphs of conventional pilings versus his telescoping sleeves. Video of the quake captured by internal drones, showing columns flexing like reeds yet rebounding unfractured. A time-lapse of orphan puppeteers stacking sand into miniature dunes atop a vibrating platform. Farid's whimsical idea, where flexible footings stayed upright while rigid models toppled. When the council reconvened, Yasmin presented the montage, concluding with a simple line. "Safety is not the absence of movement. It is harmony within movement." The vote passed 7-2. Article 23 gained a new clause, and by extension, so did every future building along the Gulf. The legal victory, however, drew attention beyond engineering circles. Media outlets amplified the narrative until investors smelled global spectacle. A tech conglomerate offered to bankroll an immersive opening ceremony, augmented reality headsets, choreographed drones, a live stream translated into 10 languages. Abdullah balked, fearing carnivalization of a structure born from humility. But the emir's court saw an opportunity to brand the house as an emblem of post-oil innovation, a beacon to lure foreign partnerships. Contracts were drafted faster than scaffolding could be struck. Abdullah wondered if he had merely traded one kind of sandstorm for another. He consulted Sheikh Adil again, meeting at dawn beneath the same olive tree. The sheikh traced crescents in the soil with his cane, shaping words without speaking. Finally he asked, "Would you forbid a moth from circling a lantern, so long as its flame remains pure?" "I fear the flame will change color," Abdullah replied. "Then feed it clear oil," the sheikh said, eyes glinting. "Define the ceremony yourself before others define it for you." Back on site, Farid suggested weaving Quranic calligraphy into the drone choreography, verses of mercy trailing as luminous ribbons in the sky. Yasmin proposed that each headset overlay should reveal unseen layers of the house's structure, turning spectators into students of physics rather than passive consumers. Abdullah agreed on one condition: the orphans would narrate. They had lived the house's tremors and lullabies. Their voices carried an authentic timbre no marketing team could mimic. Preparation blurred weeks into hyper-accelerated days. Programmers coded wind-responsive light sequences. Electricians installed fiber-optic veins beneath the cladding. Farid supervised artisans chiseling ceramic tiles with geometric patterns echoing Surah Al-Hashr's closing ayat. The entire dune shimmered under a mesh of scaffolds strung with censers and prayer flags embroidered by Dar al-Amal's girls. At night, stray photons from test runs painted constellations on low-lying clouds, and sailors adjusting their compasses thought they saw a new star rising inland. Among this frenzy slipped a shadow of sabotage. It began with a missing set of gyro-stabilizers. Then a diagnostic console reported voltage spikes at odd hours, as if someone probed security circuits. Yasmin traced anomalies to a temporary staff ID, one issued, disturbingly, in Farid's name. Confronted, the Mason roared laughter that quickly cooled to fury. Together, they discovered forged badge requests filed through a shell corporation linked to the same consortium that had lost the council vote. Fear slid into Abdullah's chest like a cold knife. The house was resilient against wind and quake, but human malice exploited subtler faults. They activated contingency protocols, biometric scans at every gate, encrypted comms for core systems, and an all-hands briefing where Abdullah spoke candidly of threatened sabotage. "We answer harm with due diligence," he said, referencing the Quranic principle of proportional response. "But we will not answer sabotage with suspicion among ourselves. Trust remains our strongest brace." For 48 tense hours, technicians combed circuits while drone pilots executed rehearsals in restricted mode. No further breaches emerged. Some believed the saboteur, seeing heightened security, abandoned the plot. Others suspected he remained, waiting. Farid advised vigilance without paranoia. Even a dune hosts scorpions, but it is also home to lilies after rain. Ceremony day dawned under a sky too clear, too still, a silence that felt like breath held. Thousands of guests funneled along glass walkways, each receiving lightweight headsets programmed with layers of architectural revelation. The orphans, dressed in crisp linen tunics, took their places on balconies fitted with directional microphones. Abdullah wore a charcoal kurta, palms damp despite the desert dryness, and recited Bismillah before stepping onto the central dais. At the appointed moment, the adhan drifted from Sirajan's minarets, overlapping in the distance like braids of melody. As the final Hayya Ali al-Falah faded, drones lifted from hidden bays, lights winking aquamarine. In augmented reality, the guests saw every beam, every anchor descending through sand into limestone, annotated with equations and Farid's hand-drawn stress notes, a living testament to humility meeting innovation. Then the children's voices rose over the comms. "In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, we welcome you to a house that listens to the wind the way the heart listens to the Quran." They told of the sirocco, the quake, the mud rain night, weaving personal memories with parabolic echoes of Surah Al-Baqarah. As they spoke, drones rearranged into cursive Arabic glowing against the morning blue. Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, verses arcing above an awestruck crowd. Halfway through the program, a low rumble rolled across the dunes. Not the orchestrated bass of subwoofers, but a natural, guttural growl. Sensors flagged a sudden pressure drop west of the coast. Abdullah's comm chirped with Yasmin's voice. Thermal updraft over the Gulf, microburst incoming. The phenomenon, rare this far south, could spawn wind shear strong enough to disrupt drone flight and buffet the house. Abdullah's role in the script called for a closing benediction. Instead, he switched channels to emergency. Recall drones to fallback altitude. Shift facade flaps to leeward configuration. Engage variable sleeves to softlock. Guests remained unaware as technicians scrambled. The children's narration faltered on one balcony. Gusts lifted their note cards. Abdullah hurried over, steadying the youngest boy, Kareem, whose fingers trembled. "It's only the wind," Abdullah assured him. "Our house knows its language." Kareem nodded, tiny chin set with courage beyond his 12 years, and resumed recitation from memory, like the farmer who waters his garden on a hill. Wind strafed again, stronger. Drones wobbled, recalibrated, regained formation. Farid stood by the main support wall, one hand splayed against the tile work as if feeling for a pulse. "She's breathing fast," he warned over comms. "Let her exhale." Abdullah toggled manual override, incrementally loosening tension cables so the frame could lean fractionally into the gust. Particle-laden air swept across spectators, peppering suits and abayas with glittering sand. Some gasped, fearing collapse. Others lifted headsets to witness raw desert ferocity meeting engineered grace. Then, almost theatrically, the gale subsided. The house straightened as cables retensioned, facade plates sliding back with a sigh. Drones reassembled above, spelling one final word: sabr, patience, before arcing out to sea in perfect geometry. Applause erupted, a thunderclap no sand could bury. Minister Saeed approached the dais, cloak whipping at his heels. "You choreographed the storm as well?" he teased. Abdullah exhaled laughter laced with relief. "No, minister," he replied. "The storm choreographed us." Night fell with jasmine-scented coolness, banquet lights strung between dune crests. Guests mingled beside reflecting pools where moonlight wavered on water like silver scripture. Investors toasted future projects. Scholars debated hadith interpretations of sand and steadfastness. But Abdullah slipped away to the highest terrace, where Farid already waited, gazing toward the unseen Mecca beyond the curvature of earth. They prayed 2 rak'ahs in quiet companionship. When they finished, Abdullah noticed Farid's leather notebook resting on the balustrade, pages fluttering in the breeze. "I have added the final entries," the mason said. "It belongs in the house's foundation archive now, not in an old man's pocket." Abdullah opened to the last page, expecting load factors, but found a single ayah. "Allah will not let your faith go to waste." Beneath, Farid had written, "Neither will sound engineering." A soft chime sounded behind them. Yasmin calling to say city officials requested Abdullah's presence for closing remarks. He closed the notebook, tucking its wisdom against his heart. "I will speak," he told Farid, "but only if the orphans stand beside me." Farid smiled, eyes reflecting starlight. "Then the house will speak through them, and through wind, and through every grain of sand that once threatened to swallow it." They descended together, footsteps light on a structure that no longer felt like ambition hardened into concrete, but like a living prayer growing patient wings. As Abdullah approached the crowd, Kareem spotted him and waved, cheeks dimpled by the day's triumphs. Abdullah raised a hand in return, sensing the dune beneath his soles, shifting, yes, always shifting, but carrying the weight of human hope with a grace he could finally trust. Night after the spectacular unveiling, desert winds carried new stories to Abdullah like letters written in dust. Some spoke of hope. Pilgrims detoured from their coastal routes just to pray beneath the wind organ, claiming its shifting chords calmed anxieties as surely as recitation of Surah Yasin. Others whispered trouble, real estate tycoons lobbying to clone the house's adaptive foundations so they could erect luxury resorts across fragile wetlands, never mind whether those ecosystems survived the insertion of metal roots. Abdullah walked the outer promenade at dawn, tracking how the rising sun polished the cladding first rose gold, then white, then a sober santan that matched the dunes so perfectly it seemed to vanish. That disappearing act felt prophetic. If the house were reduced to a blueprint for profit, its soul might evaporate just as easily. 3 months into public operation, an unexpected signature appeared in the guest log. Dr. Layla Hassan, hydrologist from the International Delta Preservation Initiative. She arrived with a small research team and a suitcase full of satellite maps showing the Gulf's shifting currents. Over hibiscus tea in the atrium, she unrolled panels of thermal imagery across a conference table. Climate oscillations are stacking like mislaid bricks, she said, tracing glowing eddies with a stylus. If the next 2 monsoon seasons align with a La Nina cycle, we could see cyclone formation farther north than recorded in the last century. Storm surge models place Sirijan, in your dune, inside the impact corridor. Yasmin flipped through the projections, lips compressed. Abdullah felt his pulse resonate with the numbers, wave heights matching column lengths, wind velocities kissing the house's design limits. We designed for storm surge, he said, but not for a hurricane parked on the estuary. Layla's eyes, dark as freshly turned earth, softened. That's why I came. The house is the only large-scale prototype of a structure that breathes with moving ground. If it holds, we can translate its principles to protect tidal villages all along the Crescent Coast. But we need a live trial, data under real storm stresses, not simulations. My institute wants to install sensor arrays in your sublevels before cyclone season. Investor representatives fretted about liability. Marketing managers salivated at headlines. The Emir's science minister pledged support contingent on positive press. Abdullah closed his eyes, conjuring again the Quranic verse that began this journey, Charity's parable of a garden on a fertile hill blessed with double rain. In scholarly tafsir, that double rain is often mercy layered upon mercy, but on his dune the double rain could literally arrive as twin storm cells. Perhaps the parable was less caution than invitation. Spend your wealth seeking God's pleasure, even if that wealth is risk capital and the donation tray is a sky full of water. He installed the sensors. Within a fortnight, the house buzzed with engineers threading fiber lines through drainage shafts, Layla's team tagging every anchor sleeve with torque gauges and microhydrophones. Farid observed their meticulousness like a proud grandfather watching surgeons operate on a child who had grown tall too quickly. Kareem and the other orphans, now permanent residents, assisting as junior docents, helped label wiring looms in neat bilingual script. Where Farid's old notebook once stored load equations, a new digital twin of the house bloomed on servers humming beneath the courtyard, a real-time hologram that pulsed with every gust, every footstep. August arrived hooded in humidity. The desert felt less like a furnace, more like a kettle reaching boil. Fishermen in Sirijan's harbor noted the water level crept higher each morning, small but relentless. Dawn skies glowed copper for hours, as if sunrise itself stalled, unable to climb through thickened air. One evening, Minister Saeed called from the capital. Satellite feeds showed a tropical depression spinning toward the Gulf, projected to deepen over water heated 2 degrees above average. Landfall models pinned its eye somewhere between Sirijan and the peninsula's rocky promontory, margin of error wide enough to swallow the house. Emergency protocols activated. Guests were evacuated. Docents led families to reinforced shelters deeper inland. Yet Abdullah insisted the core crew remain, along with Layla's scientists, to abandon the house before the storm would forfeit the data they sought. Yasmin objected, then remembered the children once sheltered within unfinished walls and acquiesced, though her eyes brimmed with unshed dread. Kareem begged to stay, the house needs its storytellers, but Abdullah made him swear an oath on the Quran to leave with the orphans. Kareem's tears wet the calligraphy edges as Farid tucked a folded compass, Mecca pointing, into the boy's palm. By sunrise, the city echoed with sirens. The Gulf flattened, an eerie glass disk under bruised clouds. Abdullah walked the dune perimeter reciting Ayat al-Kursi, sprinkling palmfuls of sand like symbolic ablution. He met Layla on the rooftop terrace, where wind snatched words off their lips. They communicated in nods, sensor clusters green, anchor torque with intolerance, battery backups full. Farid performed wudu with bottled water and led a short congregational prayer. For engineers, 2 scientists, 1 architect, 1 mason collectively lowering foreheads onto the house's polished tile. Hours crawled. Rain arrived sideways, coarse, almost granular, mixing dust and salt in sheets that needle-stitched the cladding. Variable footings hissed, releasing microbursts of compressed air to relieve lateral stress. Inside the wind organ, copper reeds moaned like a distant shipwreck choir. The sound unnerved one technician. Abdullah encouraged him to frame it as dike, a remembrance in metallic syllables. Then the eye wall hit. Instrumentation screens exploded in color, pressure dropped sharp as a guillotine, gusts clawing at 180 kilometers per hour. The house leaned, sleeves elongating 4 centimeters, to ride the gale. Outside, dunes themselves migrated, crest shearing off to slam against retaining berms. Monitors flashed amber as floating slabs beneath sublevel corridors rolled on hydraulic joints, protecting superstructure but flooding knee-deep in brine-silt slurry. Layla's team hooped data soared in gigabytes, but their bravado curdled when a steel service door groaned inward, hinges screaming. Yasmin keyed emergency seals, locking compartments. Wind organ reeds snapped in upper registers, live sound morphed into ragged breaths. The house felt alive and panicked, a creature choking on airborne sand. Abdullah forced focus onto readouts. Anchor load spiked near red line. If the sleeves failed to contract gradually when wind shifted, the fallback might jar columns into torsion fracture. He triggered a manual override, fingers flying across haptic keys while reciting the opening of Surah Al-Fath. Indeed, we have granted you a clear conquest. Conquest here meant a gateway of adaptability. He prayed the house understood. Outside, cyclone bands rotated, and with them the wind direction swung 160 degrees. Abdullah's algorithm commanded cables on the leeward side to slacken 5%, windward to tighten 3%, converting what could have been whiplash into a slow pirouette. The structure groaned, but like a palm bending in storm, it did not break. In a lull that felt biblical, silence so sudden eardrums rang. Eye of the storm centered overhead. Through a skylight, Abdullah saw a circle of bruised turquoise sky walled by spinning wrath. He remembered Hadith Qudsi about Allah's mercy surpassing his wrath and felt the analogy etched into meteorology. Farid, eyes closed, whispered takbir, then chuckled. Even the sky opens for sujud. But the respite birthed a new threat. Sensors on the seaward flank detected scour. Storm surge burrowed beneath dune layers, excavating a channel that could undercut anchor footings. Images from a submersible drone transmitted murky footage of sand washing out like grain sucked through an hourglass. Sirajan's seawall, still unrepaired fully since the quake, had funneled water inland, turning wadis into rivers that now bled into desert. Layla gasped, tracing collapse arcs on screens. If the dune's backside cavities, your foundations will dangle midair. Abdullah's throat dried. The house's genius was its capacity to dance with surface shifts, not to hover unsupported. They needed mass fill, hundreds of tons of material immediately. Sandbags would be futile. Yasmin calculated they could ballast anchors themselves, pumping seawater into internal ballast tanks originally designed to modulate weight during thermal expansion. It would increase the house's overall load, lowering center of gravity while the dune scoured. Risk. Overpressurized tanks could rupture, fracturing lower decks. Decision time, minutes. Abdullah asked Farid's opinion. The mason, ever laconic under stress, stroked his beard once. Better drown her feet than let them dangle, he said, borrowing a proverb about trees near floodplains. Layla agreed. Seawater already roared through culverts. They might as well conscript it. Yasmin initiated ballast mode, valves groaning as pumps drank from surge pools rushing the perimeter. Digital readouts climbed, plus 50 metric tons, 90, 120. The house settled half a degree into the dune, cables sighing. Outside, floodwater rose ankle to calf to thigh. Then the eye passed, southern wall of the cyclone bearing down with even fiercer winds, but surge momentum reversed, water sucking seaward. Ballast tanks now heavy anchored the frame, resisting pull. Yet suction carved deeper undercuts. Submersible feed showed hollow pockets widening, anchors hung like ribs exposed by erosion. Abdullah's heart hammered. Every pulse flashed memory of orphans sleeping in these corridors, of Kareem's wide-eyed faith. He muttered the verse, Allah does not burden a soul beyond that it can bear. He begged to be worthy of the burden. Yasmin yelled, torque within limit, hold. Farid planted both palms on a column, whispering prayers older than blueprints. Layla's sensors rendered the dune's cross-section in real time, erosion slowed, stalled. Ballast mass plus anchor flex formed a new buttress, water-carved space, but that cavity filled with the structure's own shadow weight, knitting sand and steel into an improvised arch. The storm's rear flank battered, but could not uproot. By dawn, cyclone forces waned to sullen squalls. Monitors that had pulsed crimson settled to green. Exhausted crews staggered into the atrium where muddy water lapped mosaic floors. Abdullah climbed spiral stairs to the terrace. Dune slopes looked mangled, gored by retreating currents, yet beneath him the house stood, humming like a fatigued but unbroken lung. He prayed 2 rack AHS of shuck or prostrations sinking fingertips into damp stone. Relief, though, was a thin veneer over devastation visible beyond the dune. Sirajan's harbor lay wrecked. Fishing dhows piled like splintered toys against warehouses, date groves flattened under salt water. Emergency broadcast crackled. Hospitals flooded, power grids down. Abdullah felt the weight of survival twist into responsibility. The house had weathered judgment, now it must serve. He radioed relief coordinators offering its flood-resistant halls as triage center. They accepted with frantic gratitude. Coastal clinics were knee-deep underwater. Within hours, battered buses groaned up the access road carrying the injured and displaced. Cargo lifts became gurney elevators. The wind organ gallery converted to infirmary where acoustic ducts vented sterilizing airflows. Kareem returned, leading orphans lugging boxes of supplies, determination eclipsing earlier tears. They distributed bread, dates, water purified by rooftop condensers still functional after gale. As survivors streamed in, families drenched, grandmothers clutching soaked Qurans, Abdullah realized the parable's deeper layer. A house on sand is folly only if built for vanity. Built for service, it becomes ark. Night cloaked the dune in hush broken by distant sirens. Among the refugee cots, Farid lit a lantern and began reciting Surah ad-Duha, voice gravel warm. By the morning brightness and by the night when it covers with darkness, children leaned close, listening to verses older than any storm. Layla sat cross-legged logging sensor data, pausing to wipe tears the wind had not caused. Yasmin drifted among makeshift beds, recalibrating airflow vents to reduce infection risk, while muttering Dike under her breath. Abdullah slipped into the submerged sublevel corridor, alone with ballast pumps thrumming gentle as a mother's heartbeat. Water glinted under emergency LEDs. He touched the steel, now heavy with borrowed sea, and whispered gratitude into the echoing chamber. The house answered in drip and hum, a new language forged overnight, half storm, half scripture. He imagined future architects studying these walls, learning how surrender could be engineered, how faith and calculus could co-author survival. Above, wind gusted one last sigh then tapered to calm. Moonlight reflected off pooling seawater, painting the dune silver where bays used to be. As Abdullah climbed back to the atrium, he saw Kareem asleep beside a recovering fisherman, both breathing in sync. He thought of the ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah that had haunted him from the start, the one about spending wealth for Allah's pleasure, likening it to a garden struck by double rain. The storm had indeed been a double rain, first drenching, then scouring, first terror, then necessity. Yet the garden still stood, roots deeper for being tested. He found Farid smoothing damp sand into a flat bed under a lantern. The mason smiled faintly. Tomorrow the dune will look different again, he said. It already does, Abdullah answered. Farid nodded toward the sleeping refugees. And so do we. Outside, the desert prepared to dream in the sin of salt and iron. Inside, the house exhaled ballast steam through valves glowing amber under starlight, like incense rising toward a vaulted sky that had finally quieted, for now. Dawn sifted down on Sirajan 3 days after the cyclone, quiet as ash following fire. The city lay half-submerged under brackish water that smelled of engine oil and uprooted mangroves. From the terrace of the dune house, Abdullah tracked the waterline receding a finger-breadth each hour, exposing streets tattooed with driftwood and torn prayer rugs. He kept a clipboard tucked beneath his arm, triage figures on one side, structural readings on the other, but numbers blurred whenever his gaze landed on the old harbor where minaret domes now peaked from a steel-gray lake. Inside, the wind organ had been stilled to silence, every reed wrapped in gauze so airborne pathogens would not drift through its corridors. Doctors from Médecins Sans Frontières had commandeered the gallery's mezzanine, converting brass maintenance rails into 4 stands. Farid padded between cots, distributing honey water and blessings, beard damp with condensation, eyes lit by the same resilience he once saw in limestone quarries. Layla's sensor cables now doubled as power conduits for vital monitors. Each improvisation stitched together survival, and each one borrowed the house's architecture the way refugees borrow a stranger's coat. No permission asked, just urgent necessity. By the 4th evening, the generators coughed, short on diesel. Abdullah convened a crisis circle beneath the central oculus, where warm lamplight puddled on cracked tiles. Yasmin laid out energy curves. Layla overlaid storm forecasts. Another tropical wave seeded off the equator, smaller but tracking the same warm corridor. Minister Saeed joined via satellite link, beard untrimmed, eyes ringed by sleeplessness. We have no fuel, no intact roads, and telecom towers keep blinking out, he said. Yet your house is the only triage hub above flood level. What do you need most? Time, Abdullah said. Enough to stabilize water treatment, and to reroute solar banks from the city's ruined grid. And we need volunteer builders, skilled ones, to seal scour cavities forming under the dune. If a second storm swells the water table, our ballast tanks won't buy us another miracle. The minister promised personnel, though logistics were slow as oaths borne on crippled trucks. When the call ended, Abdullah remained seated, back against a column, listening to catheter pumps and distant cries of infants fanned by student nurses. He recited from memory the verse that had become his compass. The parable of those who spend their wealth seeking Allah's pleasure is that of a garden on a fertile hill. A garden, he thought, is never finished. It is cultivated daily, or it withers. Before dawn, a convoy rumbled up the access slope. Flatbeds commandeered from airport cargo, engines wheezing salt water from their pistons. On board stood volunteers, bricklayers, microgrid electricians, even rival architects who once mocked Abdullah's dune folly. They wore mismatched life vests over neon sight jackets, tools clanging like improvised percussion. At their helm strode Kareem, a yellow hard hat several sizes too large, jaw set with youthful certitude. He brandished Farid's compass like a marshal's baton. "We got stuck for hours at the collapsed Wadi Bridge," he panted, "but we're here. Where do we start?" Abdullah's voice caught. "The scour trenches first," he managed. "Then, whatever you're willing to tackle." Work surged like a revived heartbeat. Volunteers hauled gabion baskets, wire cages packed with rocks quarried upriver, down flood-carved gullies, and stacked them to buttress the dune's flank. Yasmin supervised the rewiring of photovoltaic skins peeled from derelict billboards. She arrayed them along the house's sunward facade, their microinverters sipping stray photons even through dust haze. Layla's team strung fiber optic thermometers into the gabions, mapping every degree the sand yielded or resisted. What was once an architectural marvel morphed into a living laboratory for humanitarian engineering. As hours melted into days, the house's grand lines grew camouflaged beneath tarps and utility rigs. Journalists, barred from the floodplain, speculated wildly. Is the desert beacon failing? Abdullah ignored headlines. He had little time for optics with triage tents filling. Yet politics seeped in through any unguarded crack. One evening, an emissary from the luxury resort consortium arrived by helicopter, boots spotless while mud sucked at everyone else's ankles. He praised the house's resilience, offered a glossy memorandum, opened a branded hotel using its patented adaptive foundations, fast-track permits, percentage of profits funneled to cyclone relief. "People crave icons of safety," the emissary said. "You've built one. Let us replicate it globally, and profit funds philanthropy." Abdullah thumbed ash from a makeshift brazier, staring at orange coal that mirrored the ember glow of Farid's lanterns. "Safety isn't a market commodity," he replied. "It's an amana, a trust." He declined, knowing refusal might cost future funding, but some profits he would not tally. That night, he climbed the sand ladder to the house's roof. Storms had shaved the dune crest into a ragged silhouette. Still, stars fluttered above like verses in negative space. Farid arrived bearing 2 tin cups of cardamom coffee, steam curling in cold air. "You turned down the silver-tongued merchant," the mason observed, passing a cup. "Most men bargain with kings. You bargain with surahs." "I fear greed will hollow us faster than any storm," Abdullah said. He sipped, pulse easing as caffeine met exhaustion. "Yet the house will need funds for long-term repairs. So many cling to it now, binding their hopes to its walls like sailors lash themselves to masts." Farid sat on a beam, creak of old joints echoing. "Hope is not a burden. It is ballast," he said. "It keeps the vessel upright in moral undertow." Copper moonlight limned his face, deepening the furrows. "When you first drew this house, you wrote at the margin, 'Let structure recite the Quran.' It does, more clearly each trial. But remember, recitation without comprehension is mere sound. Open its drawings to the world. Teach others what these storms taught you." The suggestion birthed a tremor of liberation. Blueprints had been locked behind investor NDAs. Releasing them would risk litigation. Yet every day he watched nurses sterilize gauze under vents and fishermen recharge radios from repurposed panels. Knowledge grown in crisis felt like zakat due. He drafted a manifesto, the Open Sand Covenant, declaring the adaptive foundation patent-free for climate-vulnerable regions, provided any derivative design include provisions for public refuge in disasters. Yasmin refined technical appendices. Layla added environmental clauses. Farid inserted, in flowing Arabic calligraphy, an ayah from Surah Al-Hashr. Whatever is from Allah's bounty, he turns it over to his messenger so that it does not circulate solely among the rich. Karim insisted on a children's preface drawn in crayon, a simplified cutaway of the house labeled breathing walls, listening floors. The covenant went live on decentralized servers, mirrored by volunteers across 3 continents before legal teams could mount injunctions. Public acclaim outshouted corporate protests. International NGOs pledged partnership. The Emir's court, reading the geopolitical winds, announced a Gulf Initiative for Resilient Architecture, naming Abdullah chief advisor. And thus the open designs traveled faster than monsoon fronts. Adobe schools in Mauritania re-poured their footings. Mangrove-raised clinics in Bangladesh welded telescoping sleeves from recycled ship hulls. Mountain villages in Afghanistan carved floating slabs atop landslide-prone scree. Each build cited the covenant, each builder tucking a verse of mercy into foundation soil. Back in Sirajan, floodwaters withdrew enough for market stalls to reopen, but hospitals still overflowed. The house, half hospital, half prototype, pulsed day and night. During a rare lull, Abdullah found Farid napping in the wind organ, head pillowed on coil of rope. Copper reeds hummed softly, tuned by restored breeze. Abdullah kneeled to cover the mason's shoulders with a blanket, noticing the halo of pallor under his beard. Farid's breath rattled, slow and shallow. Cyclone-borne pneumonia, doctors said later. Dust-scarred lungs had reached their limit. The old mason refused evacuation. He asked to remain in the house he had midwifed. Doctors obliged, setting a cot on a mezzanine overlooking the atrium garden where succulents, irrigated by gray water, bloomed palest pink. Yasmin rigged an oxygen line. Layla placed a tablet streaming live sensor readouts beside him, rails of data he could track like rosary beads of numbers. Abdullah sat vigil most nights, reciting Surah Ar-Rahman, letting its refrain of "Which of your Lord's favors will you deny?" guide his cadence. Farid joined until breath failed, then listened, eyes alight with mischief even in frailty. One early morning, during the verse likening pearls hidden in oysters to righteous deeds, Farid grasped Abdullah's wrist, pulse faint. "She listens," the mason whispered. "Promise me she'll never stop." "She will not," Abdullah answered, tears blurring reed silhouettes above. "Nor will I." Farid's eyes drifted toward the oculus, dawn painting it rose. With a final exhale, soft as a sand mote settling, he let go. They bathed him with distilled seawater pumped the night of the storm, shrouded him in muslin trimmed from wind organ gauze, and carried him at Maghrib across the dune. Karim led the procession, compass aligned, while workers held battery lanterns whose glow etched grief in amber lines. They buried Farid at the dune's base, where scour trenches now fortified by Gabions met still damp sand. As Abdullah dropped 3 handfuls of earth upon the cloth, he felt anchor sleeves deep below adjust, slight but perceptible, an engineering salute. In the weeks that followed, monsoon season waned. Power grids flickered back, refugees returned to half-ruined homes. The house, though scarred, continued to hum. Children visited weekly to restock the infirmary they'd once inhabited. They ran fingers along reed seams now welded stronger with Farid's final design tweak, his last marginal note. A reed sings truer with tempered brass. Layla dove into data analytics, publishing findings that redefined coastal building codes from Mombasa to Mumbai. Yasmin, offered lucrative posts abroad, chose instead to oversee training academies for Gulf engineers, curriculum titled Stewardship in a Shifting World. Minister Saeed proposed a memorial plaque for Farid, the mason who taught walls to pray. Abdullah approved only if the plaque included a QR code linking to the Covenant's open repository. "Let his legacy be used," he said, "not merely admired." On the 40th day, after the janazah prayers and community meals of remembrance, Abdullah climbed the restored dune crest alone. Twilight draped the desert in indigo, but the house glowed from within. Energy harvested by repurposed billboard panels powering strings of low-warm LEDs that traced its curves like veins full of light. He carried Farid's leather notebook, pages water-stained yet legible. At the back he discovered one more entry unseen before, a sketch of the house dwarfed by dunes, captioned in looping ink. Everything built on sand will one day return to sand, save that which is built upon intention. He closed the book, tucking it beneath his arm as Adhan for Isha cascaded from minarets freshly rebuilt. Wind lifted the call until it braided with the wind organ's reopened voice, an unplanned duet weaving human devotion and architectural breath. Abdullah whispered Alhamdulillah. Then he turned to descend, toward night rounds, toward wounded fishermen needing sutures, toward plans for mangrove-footed clinics and coral-friendly sea walls inspired by a house that learned to bow. Behind him the dunes settled fractionally, anchors flexing like muscles in restful sleep, and with each minute adjustment the house answered in a chord neither sorrow nor triumph but continuation. The sound of persistence written into sand, carried on wind, recited like Quran verse by verse, without end.